Professor Salahir approached the touch-sensitive whiteboard, his fingers moving across the surface as the words materialized in bold black letters. Why human biology is officially classified as a weapon. He turned back to survey his students, 3 neat rows organized by their skin colors, red in the front, yellow in the middle, and blue in the back. The lecture hall stretched before him like a living rainbow, its tiered seating arrangement displaying the traditional hierarchy of Cryonar society in all its outdated glory. The sterile white walls reflected the artificial lighting that cast everything in sharp relief, making the color distinctions even more pronounced. Each student sat at their designated workstation, equipped with individual data tablets and neural interface ports that they rarely needed to use. Salahir paused, letting his gaze sweep across the curious faces turned toward him, allowing their anticipation to build like pressure in a sealed chamber. As a member of the Blue Caste himself, he cut an imposing figure, tall and lean, standing nearly 7 feet in height, with the characteristic strong antennae that marked his intellectual specialization. His facial features bore that uncanny resemblance to humans that had first fascinated xenobiologists centuries ago, though his skin held the deep azure hue that marked him as one of the thinking class. The traditional seating arrangement, with the blues sitting at the back, grated against his sensibilities daily. Being able to change caste at will was one of the most remarkable aspects of Cryonar biology. Yet they clung to these arbitrary divisions like ancient superstitions. Still, it was merely an annoying tradition he had learned to navigate. One small irritation in an otherwise fulfilling academic career. He approached the front row with small steps, his long legs carrying him closer to where the Reds sat with their characteristic restless energy. Their crimson skin was bright and reflective, muscles moving with the constant need for action that defined their caste. Salahir stopped directly in front of Zahir, one of his more vocal students, whose scarlet complexion had darkened slightly with the attention suddenly focused upon him. "Zahir," Salahir said, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally to blues. "Perhaps you can enlighten us. Why do you think human biology has been classified as a weapon by the Galactic Council, while the impressive biological specializations of our own species have not?" The question lingered in the air like a challenge, and Salahir could see the wheels turning behind Zahir's eyes. This was exactly the kind of moment that made teaching worthwhile. The instant when assumptions would be challenged and minds would be forced to expand beyond their comfortable boundaries. Zahir's antennae snapped to attention, rigid with the typical overconfidence that seemed hardwired into every member of the Red Caste. He straightened in his seat, his muscular frame filling out his university uniform as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be a devastating analysis. The other Reds around him leaned forward slightly, feeding off his energy like pack animals sensing a hunt. "Professor," Zahir began, his voice contaminated by that particular tone of certainty that only the young and inexperienced possessed. "It has to be because of unfairness in the classification system. The whole thing reeks of political bias." His hands gestured emphatically as he warmed to his theme, the motion fluid in the way that only enhanced reflexes could achieve. "Look at what we Reds bring to the table for our species. Superior reflexes that can react to stimuli in an instant, strength that can crush bones with our bare hands, speed that lets us cover distance that would leave other species gasping in our dust. Our senses are enhanced beyond what most aliens can even comprehend." The other Reds nodded along, their own antennae beginning to stiffen in sympathetic agreement. Zahir's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "We can see in spectrums that don't even have names in most languages, hear frequencies that would be pure silence to others. If anyone's biology should be classified as weapon, it should be ours. The humans," he made a dismissive gesture, "they're just baseline primates who got lucky with technology." Salahir watched this display with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments countless times before. The red caste's superiority complex was as predictable as their enhanced metabolism, and just as misguided. He waited for Zahir to finish, noting how the other students, yellows and blues alike, were watching with expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright skepticism. Wrong. The single word dropped into the classroom like a stone into still water, creating waves of surprise that spread through all 3 rows. Salahir turned on his heel and walked back to the whiteboard with deliberate calm, leaving Zahir sitting there with his mouth open, his confident expression crumbling into confusion. The professor raised his hand to the pristine white surface, and what began as simple circles and stick figures quickly evolved into something far more complex. His fingers moved with the accuracy that marked his cast, each line purposeful. The basic shapes transformed, gaining depth and dimension as he built upon layers of detail. Soon, an intricate, 3-dimensional molecular structure began to emerge from the digital canvas. Carbon atoms connected by bold black lines, hydrogen atoms represented by smaller spheres, the entire configuration rotating slowly to show every angle and bond. "This," Salahir said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, "is adrenaline. Epinephrine, if you prefer the clinical terminology." He touched the structure, causing it to enlarge and rotate more slowly, giving every student a clear view of its elegant architecture. A single molecule, composed of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, arranged in this specific configuration. He began to pace in front of the board as he explained. "What you're looking at is perhaps the most democratic enhancement in the known galaxy. Unlike our specialized castes, which require conscious biological restructuring and years of transition to the red color, every human, from the smallest child to the most elderly individual, can produce this compound naturally and instantaneously." The molecular structure continued its slow rotation, hypnotic in its motion. Salahir gestured toward it with evident admiration. "When a human encounters stress, danger, or even extreme excitement, their adrenal glands release this molecule into their bloodstream. The effects are immediate and dramatic." He turned back to face the class, his eyes finding Zahir in the front row. "You mentioned superior reflexes, Zahir. Adrenaline increases human reaction time to levels that match and often exceed red caste capabilities. Neural pathways that normally process information in milliseconds suddenly operate ever faster. What takes our specialized nervous systems years to develop, this single molecule grants to every member of their species in seconds." The professor's voice grew more intense as he continued. "You spoke of strength. Under the influence of adrenaline, human muscles can exert force far beyond their normal limitations. They call it hysterical strength. Mothers lifting vehicles to save trapped children. Soldiers carrying wounded comrades twice their weight across impossible distances. Their muscle fibers, normally constrained by safety limitations, suddenly operate at maximum power." He began drawing again, adding smaller diagrams around the main molecular structure. Cross-sections of human muscle tissue, neural pathways, cardiovascular systems. Speed becomes irrelevant when your entire physiology is optimized for survival. Adrenaline floods their system, and suddenly a baseline human can run faster, jump higher, and endure longer than species that have spent millennia evolving for those exact specialized traits. The reds in the front row were beginning to shift uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Salahir continued relentlessly. "But perhaps most remarkably, This enhancement comes with no training period, no conscious biological restructuring, no years of specialized development. A human child facing danger can suddenly display physical capabilities that would shame a red caste warrior of the same age. An elderly human protecting their family can achieve feats of strength that would impress our most enhanced red elders. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Every human carries within them the potential for instant biological enhancement that surpasses our specialized castes. They don't choose it. They don't train for it. It simply exists, waiting to be triggered by the right stimulus. Immediately, the front row erupted with questions. Zahir's hand shot up first, his antennae practically vibrating with agitation. But Professor, surely the enhancement is temporary. Our improvements are permanent. How long does it last? Demanded another red, her scarlet features flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger. What about the side effects? Called out a third. There have to be drawbacks. Do all humans really have this ability? Zahir pressed, clearly struggling to accept what he was hearing. Salahir found himself fielding question after question, each red student seemingly unable to believe that their specialized advantages they had literally restructured their biology to achieve, were standard equipment for an entire alien species. The questions came faster and faster, each red trying to find some flaw, some limitation that would preserve their sense of superiority. Finally, the professor raised his hand for silence. That will be enough from the Reds for now, he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that allowed him to enforce classroom discipline. You are forbidden from asking further questions until the other students have had their opportunity to speak. It was a power granted to him by university policy, one he exercised regularly when the Reds' natural tendency toward vocal dominance threatened to overwhelm the more thoughtful contributions of the other castes. The front row fell silent, though he could see the uncomfortable energy still crackling through their postures. Salahir turned his attention to the middle row, walking past the frustrated Reds until he reached the Yellows. The Yellow caste sat with their characteristic poise, their golden skin seeming to glow with an inner light that spoke of their social and emotional specializations. Unlike the quick energy of the Reds or the contemplative stillness of the Blues, the Yellows radiated a calm confidence that came from their mastery of interpersonal dynamics. One female had raised her hand, her antennae curved in the graceful, questioning posture that marked her caste's refined communication style. Her name was Mihara, and she was one of his more perceptive students. Yes, Mihara. Professor, she began, her voice gentle. I can accept that humans might match or even exceed the Reds in physical traits. That's quite remarkable, actually. But surely you're not going to suggest that they can compete with our specializations in communication, emotional intelligence, and social organization? She leaned forward slightly, her golden features animated with obvious curiosity. We Yellows have spent generations perfecting our ability to read emotional states, to facilitate cooperation between different personality types, to build consensus among disparate groups. We can form meaningful relationships with non-sapient species, creating bonds that transcend the barriers of language and cognition. Her antennae straightened as she moved toward her challenge. We are the bridge builders, the diplomats, the ones who hold societies together through sheer force of our bonding skills. I dare you to prove that humans can use emotions and social bonds as effectively as we can. Salahir smiled at the challenge, recognizing the same pattern he had seen with the Reds. The assumption that human abilities would pale in comparison to their specialized advantages. He returned to the front of the classroom and approached the whiteboard once more. An excellent question, Mihara, he said, beginning to clear the molecular diagrams and replace them with new images. Let me introduce you to the most terrifying aspect of human biology, something that pushed the Council to classify their biological traits as weapons, their social bonding capabilities. He began drawing again, but this time the images were different. Instead of molecules, he sketched social networks, complex webs of interconnection that spread across the digital canvas like a vast neural network. Humans are perhaps the most aggressively social species ever documented. Where most species form bonds within their own kind and occasionally extend limited cooperation to closely related species, humans have elevated social bonding to an art form that borders on the supernatural. The networks on the board grew more complex as he spoke, showing connections between not just individuals, but entire species, cultures, and even artificial intelligences. Consider this. Humans have successfully formed emotional bonds with literally every sapient species they have encountered since reaching space. Not trade relationships, not diplomatic treaties. Genuine emotional connections based on mutual understanding and shared experiences. He turned back to the class, his expression becoming more serious. But that's not the truly remarkable part. Humans form what they call pack bonds with non-sapient species as well. They take creatures that evolution designed to be predators, prey, or competitors, and through some mysterious process of emotional chemistry, they transform them into family members. New images formed on the board, humans interacting with various alien life forms, their body language showing clear affection and trust. On their homeworld, they domesticated wolves into dogs, turning apex predators into loyal companions. They've done the same with cats, horses, birds, and hundreds of other species. But since reaching space, they've extended this trait to alien life forms as well. Salahir's voice took on an almost awed tone. There are documented cases of humans forming emotional bonds with crystalline entities that communicate through harmonic resonance. They've established pack bonds with hive mind species that exist as collective consciousness. I've personally reviewed reports of humans who have somehow convinced a planet eater to serve as companion and emotional support to a small community of humans. The yellow caste students were beginning to look uncomfortable, their golden faces showing the first signs of the same doubt that had afflicted the reds. Salahir continued relentlessly. But perhaps most disturbing to our understanding of specialized social capabilities is their success rate. Yellow caste diplomats spend years learning to navigate the cultural complexities of a single alien species. Humans walk into first contact situations, and within hours, sometimes minutes, they're sharing food, exchanging personal stories, and forming friendships that last across decades. He began adding more detail to the social networks, showing the speed and depth of human relationship formation. They don't require specialized training in emotional intelligence because emotional connection is their default state. They don't need to study social dynamics because they instinctively understand how to create bonds across species barriers that shouldn't logically exist. The professor gestured toward the complex web of connections now covering the entire whiteboard. Every human carries within them the capacity to form meaningful relationships with virtually any form of consciousness they encounter. They can read emotional states across species barriers, facilitate cooperation between groups that have never communicated before, and build consensus among entities that shouldn't theoretically be able to find common ground. He paused, letting the implications settle over the yellow caste students. Unlike our specialized social capabilities, which require years of development and work best within familiar cultural contexts, humans can walk into a room full of aliens they've never seen before and somehow convince them all to work together toward a common goal. It's not training, it's not technique, it's simply how they're built. Immediately, the Yellows erupted with their own barrage of questions, their melodic voices overlapping as they struggled to process what they were hearing.
But surely there are species they can't connect with?
Mihara asked, her composed demeanor cracking slightly.
What about cultural misunderstandings, language barriers?
Demanded another Yellow. How do they overcome the fundamental differences in cognitive architecture? Pressed a third student.
Do they have some kind of telepathic ability we haven't detected?
Wondered a fourth. Salahir found himself once again fielding rapid-fire questions from students who couldn't quite believe that their specialized advantages were apparently standard equipment for another species. The Yellows' questions were more sophisticated than the Reds', touching on nuanced aspects of interspecies communication and social psychology, but they carried the same underlying desperation to find some limitation, some boundary to the skills humans naturally have. As the questions continued, Salahir could see the pattern emerging again, the inability to accept that their biological specializations, which they had spent years developing and which defined their entire social identity, were simply baseline characteristics for humans. Finally, he raised his hand for silence. That's enough from the Yellows as well, he declared, his voice cutting through their protests. You are also forbidden from asking further questions until the Blues have had their opportunity to contribute to the discussion. The middle row fell silent, though he could see the frustrated energy radiating from their golden forms. Like the Reds before them, they sat and obeyed, their specialized social instincts probably screaming at them to continue the dialogue they felt was so crucial to their understanding. Salahir turned and walked toward the back of the classroom, his long strides carrying him past the silenced Reds and Yellows until he reached the blue caste section. Here, finally, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. These were his people, the thinkers, the analyzers, the ones who approached problems with logic and systematic reasoning rather than emotion or instinct. The Blues sat in their characteristic poses of contemplative attention, their azure skin seeming to glow with the intensity of their focused thought. Unlike the restless energy of the Reds or the social warmth of the Yellows, the Blues radiated a calm intelligence that spoke of minds constantly at work, processing information and constructing theories. He stopped near Uhari, one of his most perceptive students, whose dark blue complexion and particularly well-developed antennae marked him as intellectually gifted even among Blues. Uhari had been watching the entire exchange with the kind of detachment that made his caste such valuable researchers and theorists. Before Salahir could ask his question, Uhari raised his hand with a slight smile playing across his features. "Let me guess, Professor," he said. "You're about to lecture us on how humans are smarter than we are, and that our intellectual specializations mean nothing compared to their baseline cognitive abilities. That's why human biology is classified as a weapon while ours isn't. Because they can outthink us just as easily as they can outfight the Reds and out-socialize the Yellows." Salahir found himself laughing, a genuine expression of amusement that rang through the lecture hall. Actually, Uhari, that's where you're wrong. Humans are not necessarily smarter than Blues as a species. In fact, I'd say that perhaps your intellectual specialization is not completely rendered useless when compared to the average human. He paused, his expression growing more serious. However, the same cannot be said when we consider their most exceptional individuals. The professor could see the mixture of relief and concern that crossed Uhari's face. Relief that his specialization wasn't completely meaningless. Concern about what exceptional individuals might imply. Salahir returned to the front of the classroom, clearing the social networking diagrams from the whiteboard and beginning to sketch new images. Let me tell you about some of the more fascinating quirks of human biology and psychology, he said, his fingers moving across the surface again as new diagrams began to take shape. Humans have developed what we might call fusion capabilities, the ability to combine the brutality of red-caste physicality with blue-caste intellectual prowess. They call it percussive maintenance. He drew a diagram showing a human striking a piece of machinery with unrestrained force. When faced with malfunctioning technology, they can analyze the problem intellectually, then apply exactly the right amount of physical force at precisely the correct location to restore function. It's a perfect marriage of brute force and analytical thinking that our caste system makes nearly impossible. The diagram evolved to show the decision-making process, rapid analysis, followed by precise physical action. But that's just the beginning of their intellectual achievements. Let me walk you through some of the remarkable innovations they've produced throughout their history. New images began flowing across the whiteboard in rapid succession. Mathematical equations, architectural marvels, artistic masterpieces, scientific breakthroughs. They discovered the fundamental mathematical relationships that govern reality while they were still confined to their home planet. Pythagoras developed geometric theorems that are still useful in interstellar navigation. Newton described gravitational forces that weren't fully understood by some spacefaring species until they had already colonized multiple moons. The images grew more complex as Salahir's enthusiasm for the subject became evident. They built structures that defied conventional engineering. Pyramids that have stood for millennia. Gothic cathedrals that reached toward the stars long before they had the technology to actually reach them. More images flowed across the board. Scientific discoveries, technological innovations, artistic breakthroughs. They split the atom while still using chemical rockets, developed quantum mechanics while barely understanding electricity, created artificial intelligence while their most advanced computers were less powerful than modern children's toys. Salahir paused, letting the scope of human achievement sink in. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. Many of these breakthroughs came from individuals who would have been considered defective by the standards of our specialized society. Einstein, who revolutionized their understanding of space and time, was considered a slow learner who struggled with basic social interactions. Tesla, whose electromagnetic theories form the foundation of most their modern technology, was obsessed with numbers and had difficulty forming normal relationships. The professor began drawing neural diagrams, showing brain structures that differed from typical patterns. Humans have individuals with what they call autism, a neurological variation that, in a few cases, grants them intellectual capabilities that can rival our blue caste specializations. But unlike our specializations, which require conscious biological restructuring, in their case is an innate trait that cannot be changed or chosen. The neural diagrams grew more detailed, showing the unique connectivity patterns that characterized some human brains. These individuals often display what humans call savant abilities, extraordinary capabilities in specific intellectual domains that exceed what even specialized blues can achieve. Mathematical calculation at superhuman speeds, pattern recognition that borders on the supernatural, memory that can store and recall vast amounts of information with perfect accuracy. Salahir's voice took on an almost reverent tone. Humans such as Alan Turing laid the foundation for all their modern computing, while his neurological differences gave him insights into machine thinking that typical minds couldn't grasp. The diagrams on the board now showed the intersection of different human skills: physical prowess enhanced by intellectual analysis, social bonding guided by analytical thinking, creative expression informed by mathematical precision. What we are seeing is a species that doesn't specialize because they don't need to. Their baseline capabilities in multiple domains are so high that specialization becomes a choice rather than a necessity. The classroom fell into an unusual silence as Salahir finished his explanation of human neurological diversity. For a moment, the three castes sat in their respective rows, processing the implications of everything they had heard. Then something strange happened. Zahir, from the Reds, turned in his seat to look back at Mihara from the Yellows, and she nodded almost imperceptibly toward Uhari in the Blue section.
Professor,
Zahir said,
I think I speak for all of us when I say we need you to cut through the academic build-up and give us the real answer.
His scarlet features were set in determined lines, but there was less of his earlier arrogance.
Why exactly is human biology classified as a weapon by the Galactic Council while ours isn't?
Mihara stood as well, her golden skin seeming to shimmer with nervous energy.
We've heard about their physical power, their social bonding, their intellectual achievements, but there has to be something more. Something that crosses the line from impressive to dangerous.
Even Uhari rose from his position in the back, his blue features grave with understanding.
Professor, we're not children. We can handle the truth. What makes humans so threatening that the Council felt compelled to classify their biology as a weapon?
Salahir looked at his students. All three castes united for the first time in his recent memory, their usual hierarchy forgotten in the face of a shared need for answers. He walked back to the whiteboard and began drawing again, this time creating images that showed not individual human capabilities, but humans working together.
Very well,
he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone.
Let me explain what truly terrifies the Galactic Council.
It's not any single human ability.
It's how those abilities work in combination and how they scale when humans coordinate as a species.
The first diagram showed humans running in formation, their bodies glistening with perspiration as they moved across varied terrain.
Consider this. Humans are persistence hunters. Their bodies are designed for endurance that puts most species to shame. While we Cryonar can sprint faster and jump higher in short bursts, humans can run for hours, sometimes days without stopping.
He added more detail to the diagram, showing the human cardiovascular and respiratory systems.
But here's what makes this capability truly dangerous. They do this naturally, without enhancement, and they can do it while coordinating complex group strategies. Imagine a human military unit that can pursue targets all day, constantly communicating and changing their tactics.
Zahir's antennae twitched nervously.
But surely endurance alone isn't...
It's not just endurance,
Salahir interrupted, beginning a new diagram.
Humans are what we call generalist omnivores, with digestive systems that can process almost any organic matter they encounter. Our species, like most in the galaxy, evolved specialized diets. Reds require high-protein sustenance to maintain muscle mass. Yellows need specific nutrients for neural chemistry. Blues consume certain fruits for cognitive enhancement.
The diagram showed comparative digestive systems, human organs capable of breaking down diverse food sources versus the more specialized Cryonar system.
Humans can eat plants, animals, fungal matter, even some forms of bacterial colonies. They can survive on the native food sources of virtually any habitable planet they encounter. The Galactic Council has classified this as a potential weapon because it means human forces can operate in environments where other species would starve.
Mihara's face had paled to a sickly yellow-green.
They can survive anywhere?
Essentially, yes.
Salahir's next diagram showed human settlements across various planetary environments.
This extends beyond diet. Humans can acclimate to extreme temperatures, varying atmospheric pressures, different gravitational conditions. He gestured toward the images of humans living in strange places. We've seen human populations thrive in Arctic conditions. Others flourish in tropical environments with humidity levels that would be fatal to many species. They've learned to live at altitudes where the oxygen is too thin for normal respiration, and in underground environments with no natural light. Uhari's voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the classroom. That is too much for a single species. Salahir ignored the comment and turned to face the class, his expression grave. The Galactic Council classified human biology as a weapon because they realized that humans don't compete. They systematically occupy, not through conquest, but through lack of fear and persistence. They arrive at a planet, adapt to its conditions, form bonds with local species, and before anyone realizes what's happening, they've become an integral part of the ecosystem. The classroom had fallen completely silent. Even the usual rustling of clothing and shifting of positions had stopped as every student absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. It was Mihara from the Yellows who broke the silence.
Professor,
She said.
I think we've been approaching this all wrong.
She turned to address Zahir and the other Reds directly.
We've been thinking about this as a competition, as if humans were somehow diminishing our value or threatening our specializations. But that's not what the professor is telling us, is it?
Zahir's scarlet features showed confusion, then gradual understanding.
You mean? I mean, we're looking at this like there are enemies, when they might be the greatest opportunity our species has ever encountered.
Mihara's voice grew stronger, more confident as she warmed to her theme.
Think about it. If humans can do all these things naturally, and they're as socially adaptable as the professor described, then they're not trying to replace us, they're trying to work with us.
She gestured toward the diagram still glowing on the whiteboard.
Their pack bonding behavior, their ability to form relationships across species barriers. If we let them, they want to include us in their social networks.
Zahir's antennae slowly straightened as the implications became clear. No, they're not like us! As the Yellows tried to convince the Reds about the necessity for cooperation, Salahir paused near Mihara's seat, acknowledging her insight with a nod.
As our Yellow Caste representatives are already demonstrating, the path forward lies in building friendships with humanity rather than viewing them as competitors. I've observed that many of our Yellow diplomats are already establishing meaningful relationships with human representatives, and they're beginning to convince members of other castes to transition to Yellow in anticipation of a long period of peace.
He turned to the front of the classroom, his expression thoughtful.
My personal opinion, and this is beyond the scope of official curriculum, is that our future will be one of cooperation with humanity.
The professor looked out at his students, Reds, Yellows, and Blues, seeing them not as separate castes, but as representatives of the strengths that could perhaps complement human abilities in a distant future.
The question isn't whether we can match their abilities, Salahir concluded. The question is whether we can learn to combine our specialized strengths with their generalist behaviors to create something greater than either species could achieve alone.
The bell chimed, signaling the end of class, but none of the students moved to leave, not even the Reds who were usually the first ones running toward the door. Now, they sat in contemplative silence, processing not just the information they had learned, but the fundamental shift in perspective that would reshape how they viewed their place in an increasingly human-influenced galaxy.